area of interest is vertebrate field zoology, so she likes fish, snakes, salamanders, birds, and mammals. She is a valued member of the department and highly respected by the Samford community. She is an authority on the rare endemic red-heeled salamander of Alabama. And she has published many papers and articles. Kristin was raised in Huntsville, Alabama. For a graduate degree, Kristin attended the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, where she majored in chemistry. She served her country for 10 years, often on ships in the Persian Gulf. She has a Master of Science in Zoology from Auburn University and a PhD from Utah State. She was in the Naval Reserves, and while at Samford in 2015-16, she was activated to serve at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. We've all heard about the prison there, but that is just a small, tiny part of the naval base. This is a base that can handle almost all ships of our fleet. With the rank of captain in the Navy, Kristin, I think, was right near the top in running the base. Even so, she found time to study the fauna of the area and in fact has a paper to be published on a rare lizard she studied while there. Kristin is now retired from the Navy and was honored at Annapolis for her years of service. She likes cats and has several feline friends at home. So I give you Dr. Kristin Bakkegard, who will talk to us about the natural history of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's very good to see all of you today, even if virtually. I am going to, there we go. I have muted everybody, so hopefully it will come through a little bit clearer. And what I planned to do today was I have a PowerPoint presentation. It's mostly just a lot of pictures of the plants and animals that are down there. But I will do what's called, I will share my screen. So you should be able to see the presentation there and listen, and I will go through, and then we will leave some time for questions at the end. So that's my plan, and I hope it all works here. So let me do my screen sharing. And I will share my computer sound. Good. Slideshow to come up. All right. So is everyone able to see that? Can people just give me a thumbs up? Okay, good. Thank you very much. And let me get my... All right, so good morning. As I'm going to talk about the natural history adventures that I had when I was stationed down at the Naval Station at Guantanamo Bay for about a year. And here is the hopefully now famous lizard. We'll see. And so just a very brief introduction about Naval Station Guantanamo Bay. It's often known as GITMO. And so you'll see it abbreviated a couple different ways, but it's America's oldest Navy base. It was established in 1903, and we pay to Cuba a yearly lease for the use of that property. And I was stationed there from July of 2015 to June of 2016, so 11 months. So I really got a good opportunity to really just get to know the place. And the base commanding officer was kind enough to really let me explore most areas of the base. And the thing about being stationed at Guantanamo is, though, even though you are in Cuba, you don't get to see Cuba. So nobody is allowed to leave the base. The only way on the base is by air or by sea. And that all stems back from 1958 when Raul Castro part of their Cuban Revolution, kidnapped some sailors and Marines, kept them for about 3 weeks or so, and then the Navy said, we can't be having this. So there's been no off-base liberty in Guantanamo since then. So when you're there, you are there. And the base itself is like a little slice of 1980s America. And so for today's talk, I'm going to, briefly the location, a little bit of geography. I will talk very briefly about the history of the base. The full history is a major talk in and of itself. There's been so many things that have happened down there. That's really, really interesting place for those that are history buffs. And then the biodiversity of the base. And that's what really got me excited, especially when I first started showing up down there. I'm like, this is a new Caribbean ecosystem that I'd not experienced before. And I just had a blast trying to find as many different animals and plants as I could and learning about as much as I could about them while I was down there. And so that's kind of the outline for today's talk. And so we are here on the island of Cuba, which is the largest island in the Greater Antilles. All of these islands here make up the Greater Antilles. Here's some of the Lesser Antilles here. Here are the Bahamas, and of course we know Florida. Jamaica is here. Puerto Rico is here. So this kind of orients us big picture wise is where we are in the Caribbean, and the base itself is at the far eastern end. And it essentially guards the Windward Passage. And the Windward Passage is this seaway that goes in between Cuba and the island of Hispaniola. And so that's where we are at the very far eastern end of Cuba. And so before the Spanish showed up, there's a rich history of indigenous peoples that live there, the Taino. But then the Spanish showed up. This was Columbus, and he showed up on the 30th of April in 1494. He was there looking for gold, didn't find anything, did note that it was an excellent natural harbor. And then he went on his way and continued his explorations. But there's actually a small monument on the base close to the area where it's thought that he landed there at the Fisherman's Point. And then really the history of Cuba is really entwined with that of the Spanish and the Spanish Empire. And the British made a few stops here and there along the way. But Guantanamo Bay itself was noted very much as being an excellent natural harbor. And the bay is deep enough, and the base itself is at the entrance of the bay, that you can bring aircraft carriers in there. So it's nice deep water. The main channel there is about 80 to 90 feet. So it's a good deep water harbor. So in the United States, kind of became entangled in some world affairs, and we were kind of stretching our legs a little bit. There was the Monroe Doctrine that said, yes, we should be interested in what goes on in the Caribbean since it's kind of on our back door. We sent a ship, the USS Maine, down to Havana in part to protect the American interests that were in Cuba at the time. And it was sunk in April of 1898. And based on that, the United States declared war on Spain. Now, at this time, Cuba had already been in rebellion against Spain for the previous 30 years. So the Cubans were trying to get their independence from the Spanish. We went down there and got kind of entangled in things when the USS Maine was sunk. And so the United States, we declared war on Spain and started getting troops together to send down there. And Guantanamo was one of the first places that American troops landed in Cuba. And there was a series of battles in June of 1898 at Guantanamo. It was it's an example of very early amphibious operations where the Marines went ashore and they were supported by the Navy and naval gunfire support, and we won. And this battle, if you're trying to place kind of this in the context of the Spanish-American War, you know, Teddy Roosevelt at San Juan Hill, that happened on the 1st of July in 1898. So this is just a view. It gives you kind of a nice view of some of the mountains. It's kind of a semi-hilly place. These are not really high hills, kind of similar to Birmingham, where we've got a series of hills. But you can see that it's very dry. And it's one of the driest areas within Cuba. And so that dryness and lack of rain really drives the ecological systems here at Cuba. But this is looking down on one of the hills. One of the battles was down in this area. It's a really lovely beach right here. And this is the Caribbean Ocean. So you get some really beautiful views when you're down there. And so here is a map of the base, kind of showing the outlines. It was established 1903 via a treaty with Cuba, and we re-signed that treaty in 1934. The mission of the base right now is to maintain our presence, the United States presence in the Caribbean. It's also a logistics stop. We have a lot of, we send Coast Guard ships and naval ships into the Caribbean to do a lot of drug interdiction operations, and they will make stops at the naval base at Guantanamo to refuel, get fresh fruits and vegetables for the ship, and give a chance for the crew just to get out and stretch their legs a base. The base itself is about 45 square miles, and so from this corner to this corner, just to give an idea of scale, about 5.6 miles. From here to here, across the entrance is about 9 miles. And running through the base is also the Guantanamo River. But this is this really excellent deep water harbor right here. And as part of the treaty, Cuba has 2 towns up here that are dependent on the sea. Is that Cuban shipping by treaty and boats are allowed to come through here. Now they're escorted by our security boats, but Cuba still maintains this link to the sea, even though we control this area here. But it's just a great harbor. And this is the area where we fought the battle with the Spanish. And Fisherman's Point, this is the area where Columbus landed. So that gives you kind of a general idea of the size of the base. Here's just a couple other pictures. The Cubans have their observation posts out in some of the hills surrounding the base. And so this is a zoomed out picture I was able to take. And then this is just a picture of the fence line. Again, you can see some of these small hills, but here's the American side. This is the road that the Marines drive to maintain security. Here is the Cuban side, and the Marines sponsor a road race everywhere where you get to run this road, basically the length of this road. And in their safety briefing to us, they told us that the Cubans still have their mines over here. So if a mine just happens to go off, to not be alarmed by the noise. So it's a little different place to be stationed. Just a few other pictures of some of the kind of historical structures that are still in use. Here is the headquarters for the Marine Security Company that provides the security for the base. This is the northeast gate. So American side here, Cuban side over here. And the base commanding officer meets with the Cuban colonel who's in charge of the army forces in this area of Cuba. They meet once a month at the northeast gate, and they alternate. 1 month they meet on the American side, the next month they meet on the Cuban side. But this is the gate that if you were to drive out into Cuba, this is the gate through which you would go. But except for that monthly meeting, nobody comes in and outside of this gate. And at the northeast end, there's also a water gate here. And here's an American tower, and then these are just a couple other towers that we have on our side that the Marines use to keep an eye on things. So what I really want to talk about is some of the amazing biodiversity that's down there. And it was just incredible. And I was really surprised. I didn't know much about the Caribbean. When I got there, I bought a couple field guides, but really didn't understand it until I was there and started hiking some of the trails. But plenty of lizards. You're going to see lots of pictures of lizards today. A few snakes. Here's one of the snakes here, the Cuban racer. These were very, very common on the base and kind of similar to our racers that we have here in the southeast. So quick, fast, kind of nervous snakes. Turtles, only one freshwater turtle. The other turtles that are there are sea turtles that nest on their beaches. Since it's such a dry place, there's very few amphibians, and I was able to find 4 of the 5 species of frog and toad that live there. And then historically, there's been 1 crocodile. So it's really all about the lizards when you're thinking about reptiles and amphibians at Guantanamo. The birds, there's at least 130 species of bird that call that area home or that use that area, especially in their migration. So it was a great place, especially in the winter, to see all of the wintering warblers. And so I saw more warblers there than I usually see here at home. But then there's also a series of endemics. These are birds that are only found in Cuba, and that's the only place where you can go to see them. And so I saw a good number of the endemics. There's a few birds that are only found in the Caribbean. I was able to see many of those, including this hummingbird. And then since you're right there on the coast, there was a lot of egrets and herons and shorebirds, plenty of turkey vultures, and then lots of American kestrels feeding on a lot of these lizards that were up here. The mammals, there are very few mammals, but a couple of iconic ones, and I'll show you the Demarest hoodia. I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. And then the Antillean manatee. And they stay and feed in the bay. I only saw glimpses of manatees. They're relatively shy. Lots of butterflies and moths and more than enough wasps and bees. And I'll show you a few pictures of those. Here's one of their carpenter bees. The male is a bright orange, just a beautiful insect. I won't talk a whole lot about the plants. I will show you some pictures because I'm more a zoologist rather than a botanist. But the cactuses, they've got 6 species of cactus there, so fairly rich cactus fauna. And one of the early scientists to go down and start doing surveys at Guantanamo was down there in 1909 and wrote several very important papers just on the cactuses that they found there. There's the West Indian mahogany tree, which is an endangered tree, but well protected on the base. The lignum vitae, that's the tree of life. And then lots of bromeliads, agave, passiflora. We've got passiflora here in Alabama, a couple species. They've got those beautiful complex flowers. And then since we're in the Caribbean, there's also a whole nother rich ecosystem just associated with all the marine life. And so people that are stationed at Guantanamo, most people take full advantage of the opportunities. You can go scuba diving and snorkeling in the bay. Excuse me. So really, now I'm just going to go through a series and we're going to look at a lot of pictures of critters. So I'm going to kind of start with the amphibians. We'll go through the reptiles, birds, mammals, and then off to some of the plants and a little bit of the marine life. But I really just wanted to give you a taste of some of the things that are down there. So this is the Cuban tree frog. It's native to Cuba. It's become invasive in Florida, and it's slowly making its way over to Alabama. But this is one of Cuba's native frogs. Here is the Cuban small-eared toad, and I only saw these very, very rarely, usually after a heavy rain. It took a heavy rain to bring these toads out. Because again, the base, and it's just a very, very dry place, less than 8 inches of rain a year. And this is a little tiny frog. So you can see this is my finger here in the background. This little frog is maybe an inch long. So little tiny things, but they're there and seem to be aptly named. And so these are 3 of the 5 species of amphibian that are found down at the base. They've got a great snake, and it's the Cuban Boa. And these can get to be about 10 to 12 feet long. So I got to hold one. There's another scientist that goes down there twice a year to radio track the boas to try to understand the habitat that they use. And so I went out with him and got to hold one of the boas. And this is just, it's an incredibly powerful animal. I mean, this is all muscle, and this is about 40 pounds of snake. So it was a great fun and great privilege to be able to hold and experience one of these animals just firsthand. But if you get the light just right, they have a beautiful iridescence to their scales. They are fairly secretive. There's a lot of high grass on the base. And I went out radio tracking a few times with Pete when our time overlapped down there. And he would be getting a signal. And you're looking down in the grass and you're like, there's a 10-foot snake in this grass. And neither of us are seeing it. And we're both experienced at seeing snakes. So that was a little bit disconcerting, but they're not aggressive. They're fairly shy. But this base probably has a population, his population estimate is roughly 10,000 of these snakes on the base. Whereas in the rest of Cuba, they are endangered. For all the usual reasons, snakes are endangered. But in most part, just because people are afraid of snakes. But on the base, they are very, very well protected. The only mortality is really if they accidentally get run over. So this is the Cuban Boa, one of kind of the big, iconic, really cool animals that's found on the base. I mentioned that this was a place for nesting of sea turtles, and there's been several scientific studies. And so I was fortunate one night, I was just down at one of the beaches at night, and this was a female hawksbill sea turtle that came up onto the beach, and probably 6 to 7 feet long. And my estimate was 150 to 200 pounds. Very, very awkward when out on the land, but you'd see, especially juveniles, seem to use the bay quite a bit. So snorkeling and scuba diving, you would see them, and in the water, they're incredibly graceful animals. But it's certainly very awkward for the females when they have to come up onto the beach to lay their eggs. So this was really neat to be able to see one of these great sea turtles. We'll talk about lizards a little bit. You're going to see a lot of pictures of lizards now. So the paper just came out in Caribbean Naturalists like less than a month ago. And while I was there, this was very much an accidental discovery. There's this lizard, and it's the Guantanamo striped curly-tailed lizard. And the only place it was known from is this spot on a little remote mountaintop about 30 to 40 miles away from the base. I had never seen or heard of this lizard before until I went down there. And then it was early on, I took a picture of the lizard, of a lizard, a couple pictures of it. I didn't know what it was. It didn't seem to match up with any of the pictures of any of the other lizards on the base. And so just started doing some investigation and reading, and eventually came up with we think it's this lizard. So now we have to prove it. And so this paper here talks about both the morphology. There's some very important characteristics like no striping on the throat and how the stripes come all the way down on the tail. And then we also did a DNA analysis. That's what Dr. Johnson and Dr. Mulcahy did. Is I brought back a little bit of tail tip. They were able to extract the DNA, compare that DNA sequence to other lizards in this group of Leocephalus. And we were able to show that, yes, indeed, this lizard is here on the base. And the reason why that's very, very exciting is the only populations ever known were just from this remote mountaintop. And there's only been 7 individuals of this lizard ever seen. And I had almost 70 sightings here at different times. So during that first year when I was down there, and then I went back down a couple other times, specifically to look for the lizard. So it's really exciting to kind of stumble upon. It was a completely accidental discovery. But now we have another population, and there was juvenile, so it's a breeding population, so that's even more exciting. That seem to be doing, there's not very many of them, they're not at a high population density, but now that's a big hint, and hopefully the Cuban biologists, and Cuba has a very rich history of biology and herpetology, to start looking and checking all of these intermediate places to see if there's not further populations of this lizard. So something that was once thought to be extremely rare is at least there's another population here. And my guess is that there are more along this way here. So that was one of those, it was kind of an accidental discovery. It's like, hey, let's take some pictures of lizards. And it actually turned out to kind of be, if I might brag a little bit, a big deal. So I'm very excited that I found this lizard. And so these are the other curly-tailed lizards. These 3 here, the pallid, the side-blotched, and the saw-scaled. These are super, super common on the base. And then this Alber's amaiva. When I first saw this, I saw this bright blue tail and thought, oh, there's a skink. It just seemed very similar, and it acted very similar to our skinks here in the United States with that bright blue tail. But instead, it's in another group of lizards called the Teiids. But the rest of these are very common on the base. And that's what I thought I had found with this one was just a really odd form of maybe one of these. Actually, I thought I'd found an odd form of this pallid curly tail. And that's why we needed the DNA to absolutely make sure that it was not one of these other 3 species of curly-tailed lizards. If you go to South Florida, this saw-scaled curly-tailed is found across the Caribbean. These 2 species, I believe, are just Cuba only. But this one has also been introduced to South Florida and is doing very well. And it's kind of a Caribbean species. And this is also a Caribbean species of lizard. So I told you you were going to see lizards today. There's also anoles. And those are usually up in the trees. And we all know anoles because they have these bright and colorful dewlaps that the males like to flash at their rivals and that the males like to flash at the ladies. And so there's a very rich, and this is just a sub-sample of the anoles that are found there. These are very, very large, and they can nip you pretty good. This one is also very, very common. And then this Cuban green anole, if you've seen our green anoles here in the southeast, you're like, hey, this looks very, very familiar. And there's more and more genetic evidence that says the Cuban green anole and our green anole here in the southeastern United States are probably the same species, and that our green anoles originally came from Cuba. And so very rich lizard diversity down there. The most famous lizard at Guantanamo and the most iconic lizard at Guantanamo is the iguana. And again, the iguanas, these are rock iguanas. It's a different species than the green iguana that maybe you've seen in Central America. These are rock iguanas that are found throughout the Caribbean. And these guys get to be about 5-6 feet long. And they are just a lot of fun to watch. And, you know, here's one crossing the road. This one's taking up half a lane on a 2-lane road. And so we've got males, we've got females. There's signs all over the base for people to watch out for them. Because then these rock iguanas are endangered and hard to find on the rest of Cuba. They are fairly common on the base, and every base resident has interacted with them. They all have their territories. They have burrows, and they stay more or less in the same spot. So everybody kind of has their iguana that may live outside of their building or near their home that people will, you know, at least say hi to every morning as they go into work. But lizards, being lizards, are really cool, and they have a lot of neat behaviors. And so this is a discussion between 2 Cuban rock iguanas. So clearly they came to some sort of agreement as to where the property line is. And so these are just fun to see on the base. Now we're going to kind of shift over into some of the birds. And this is another Cuban endemic. This is the bee hummingbird, and this is the smallest bird in the world. And I only got to see them on a few occasions in the winter. So this is a male, but it's in its winter plumage. Their summer breeding plumage, they're little jewels, but it's these little tiny hummingbirds. And like our hummingbirds that we have here, they like to chitter away. So a very quick view of a bee hummingbird, but I only saw these when I was down there one winter, but it's just neat to say, hey, I've seen the smallest bird in the world. But hummingbirds are always a lot of fun. Another iconic kind of creature on the base, although it stays more in the wooded areas, is the Cuban Pygmal Owl. So this is a small owl, probably less than a foot high. And there was a small forest that I had to hike through in order to go to my lizard sites. And there was always usually 1 or 2 there, just wondering what I was up to. And the other cool thing about Cuban pygmy owls is that they have a set of eye spots on the back of their head. And they just always look so serious. So I always enjoyed seeing the Cuban pygmy owls. They were a fun bird to see. Another endemic, this is the Cuban toady. And when I first saw one, I thought, Maybe it was a hummingbird. And then finally got some really good pictures of them, got the field guide out. But this bird is only found in Cuba, and its closest relatives are actually the kingfishers. And if you look at that bill, it's like, yeah, that looks like a little tiny kingfisher. But these were very common on the base, and they were always noisy and just kind of chittering around. So I called these the Morse code bird. And so usually you would hear them first, and then you would be able to go and find them. But even with this very, very bright plumage, they could be difficult to see. And so you would hear them, but have a difficult time actually seeing exactly where it was. But a neat bird that was down there. I always enjoyed seeing the Cuban toadies. They had this is a West Indian endemic, the West Indian woodpecker. They're found throughout the Caribbean. But you'll note that they look very similar to our red-bellied woodpeckers here in the South. And in fact, they're in the same group as our red-bellied woodpeckers. And they would get on buildings and they would hammer away. I really liked them. It looks like they've got eyeshadow on. But a lot of base residents considered them a nuisance if they were hammering on their house early on a Saturday morning. And then here's a Cuban endemic. This is the Cuban green woodpecker. And so I would see these periodically, but another just really beautiful bird. Here's a few other Cuban or Caribbean endemics. So the white-cheeked pintail is a duck. It's found throughout the Caribbean. Here's the Cuban vireo, has a very, very beautiful song. This warbler is found only in eastern Cuba, the Oriente warbler. And then the Cuban gnatcatcher is the Cuban version of our blue-gray gnatcatcher that we have here in the Southeast. And these guys were really common and very nosy and curious and also very noisy. So I would be out trying to find my lizards, and there would always be a group of 3 or 4 of these in the bushes, just kind of checking up on what I was up to and kind of chittering away at me as well. A few other birds that are found in the Caribbean, the great lizard cuckoo, and these birds are about the size of crows, maybe even a little bit larger. They weren't chunky like crows, but they were out hunting lizards. I mean, that's why they're named there. But these very, very large birds that flew nearly silently. And so you would hear one, and then you would just kind of see a shadow, and you knew one had gone past. The common ground dove, a really pretty dove that they had there. And when they fly, they've got some really beautiful cinnamon coloration on their underparts. Here's the red-legged thrush. It's in the same group as our robins. It kind of has that general shape, but clearly very aptly named with those red legs. Usually in the scratching around in the leaves, looking for something. And then here's the Antillean nighthawk. And it's a neotropical migrant. So in the fall, it would disappear and then come back again in the spring. You rarely saw them perched on anything. You would see them in the evenings flying around catching insects. And so they hunt at night and they just catch insects on the wing, and you would see a large, fairly large bird and then that white wing bar, and you knew you had seen a nighthawk. Some warblers, these are all neotropical migrants. We find them here in the United States. They often winter down in Cuba and in the Caribbean. And with the scrub thorn, they're much easier to see than in our leafy overstory that we have here. Here's the banana rat. This is approximately an opossum-sized mammal. And they too are very, very common on the base to the point of being pests. Rare in the rest of Cuba. Hootias are only found in the Caribbean. It's a Caribbean group of mammals. They're called the banana rat because their feces are kind of curved banana shaped. So that's where they get get their nickname from. But they would be up in the cactus. They would be in piles of things. They would be up in the trees. Generally nocturnal. They lived in family groups. You'd be out walking in the evening, and you would just hear a group of them. And then sometimes you'd see them out during the day. And a lot of variation in their color patterns. This one's very lightish. You'd see some darker ones, almost black. But just an iconic Caribbean animal and iconic animal on the base. The other mammal I saw down there was these bats. There's a lot of old structures on the base, and the bats have taken them over. So sometimes you get a little bit of surprise. Great spiders, if you're into spiders. Here's a green lynx spider that's ambushed a bee. Tarantula. And these nested in burrows on the ground, and then sometimes go wandering out around the base as males are out looking for females. Lots of different butterflies. So this is just a small sampling. Here's a dragonfly having a very bad day. Here's a praying mantis that's managed to snatch up this dragonfly. Here's another dragonfly down in a striped saddlebags. It's some really pretty dragonflies. And then these are the caterpillars called the tetrio. They go to the tetrio sphinx moth, but very, very brightly colored. I don't think you'd want to be eating those. Lots of stinging things. So Cuban paper wasps, and these guys are a little more aggressive than our paper wasps that we have here in the United States. If you got within 10 feet of one of these nests, they would start coming off of there. I got stung more in Cuba than I've been stung anywhere else in the course of my field biology. Tarantula hawks, these guys are out hunting tarantulas. Here's just a potter wasp. They make little mud nests. And there's also a scorpion down there. This is just another look of kind of some of the habitat and how dry it is. The scrub thorn, lots of cactuses, lots of plants with spines. And then this little hill is right outside the base. There's a little Cuban observation tower right up here. The fence line is about right in here. But yeah, I so wanted to go hike up that thing until I realized, oh, it's on the wrong side of the fence. Can't go there. Lots of cactus. And this one made a bright yellow fruit that was, I think it's an edible fruit. But this is about baseball-sized fruit on this cactus. And then this is a very common cactus on the base. Some palms. This is a native palm that's found in the Caribbean. A few flowers. There's no good, this one has a common name to it. These do not have common names to it. This is an endangered flower, endangered plant in Cuba. But all of these, this one is called the fiberglass plant. If you look at these leaves, it's got all of these little tiny spines on there. If you brushed up against one of those things, you'd be pulling little tiny spines out of your clothes or off of your hand for quite some time. This was definitely a plant to not brush up against. This one was just really spiky, but had this beautiful red flower on it. This was kind of a vine. This is just a beautiful flower. And this is the purple flower from one of the trees down there, a lignum vitae tree. There's also a really interesting habitat associated with the mangrove. So the Guantanamo River runs through the base, and you could take a boat up in here to this bridge, at which point you could not go past that bridge. But there was also 2 to 3 species of mangrove trees, and then all the plants and birds. This is an anhinga associated just with the mangroves. And if there were crocodiles on the base, they would be up in here in the Guantanamo River. Also very buggy too. This is one of the nesting beaches for the sea turtles. And there was a great reef right in here. This is a beautiful place to go snorkeling and scuba diving. And there are a few places on the base that are kind of limited access only, in part to protect them ecologically, just from too much overuse. Lots of crabs. So kind of a terrestrial hermit crab. This is one of the Caribbean hermit crabs, these big purple crabs that all came out when it was raining. They'd all go marching out across the roads. Here's a small rock crab. So very rich sea life there, just with a couple species of crab. And then, you know, the underwater ecosystem could also just be a whole talk in and of itself. So I did a lot of snorkeling, went scuba diving a few times, saw a remora. And I thought that was really cool because I'm like, if there's a remora here, where's the shark? We didn't see any sharks, but these remoras were certainly interested in trying to attach to one of our divers' tanks. Here's a stingray and some of the seagrass, and just kind of a reef with a variety of fish here. Lionfish have invaded, so this is an invasive species into the Caribbean. And one of the hobbies for the scuba divers is to go out and spearfish to remove as many lionfish as possible, and they actually taste really good. So a couple folks will get enough large lionfish and then cook them up for dinner. So it's a really good tasting fish. You just have to be very, very careful with all of these spines. They have no predators. So they are predators themselves. So they're spreading throughout the Caribbean and starting to cause a problem. Beautiful sponges. And just a kind of variety of sea life. These really large, these starfish, there we go, sorry. You know, these are larger than your hand. Here's the conch. There's some jellyfish down there. This is a moon jellyfish. Here is a sea urchin feeding on some of the turtle grass. You saw some beautiful moonrises. And I was really only able to give you guys a small sampling of the things that I saw down there, but I have an iNaturalist page. And for my Cuba adventures, I've got almost 525 photographs of things down there. Not all of them been identified as species, but a good number of them have. So if you want to see more pictures of the incredible biodiversity that is on this base, this is my username on iNaturalist, and then you can just do there's a filter, and you can just put in Cuba, and you'll be able to see the full list. So we just barely scratched the surface today of what's down there. It really is an amazing little corner of the Caribbean. And I will leave you with this beautiful sunset. And let's see. So I hope everybody was able to see that okay. And if there are questions, I will take any questions.
I have a question for you. I noticed you mentioned how there were 80 species of butterfly. That seems like an extraordinarily large number, especially on a base that only has 45 square miles. I noticed that in my Butterflies of Alabama, which I have spent a little time looking through, that Alabama only has 84 species of butterfly. Is Cuba must be very well endowed with butterflies and moths. I'm not sure that's a particular interest of yours, although I've always liked butterflies.
There's a group that went from, I think, or the Natural History Museum of Florida made a couple trips down there to fully document the butterfly diversity on that base. And so they've got a paper just on the butterflies, and then they have a paper just on the plume moths, just a small subgroup of moths. I think the biodiversity in the Caribbean is, and I didn't realize this either, is really not that well known to us that, you know, live in more temperate areas. As you know, since I was down there, I've done a lot of reading, especially on the reptiles and amphibians of the Caribbean, and there's over 1,000 species of just reptile and amphibian in the Caribbean, which I had no idea. I mean, I think about Alabama as being a great biodiversity hotspot, and we've got incredible richness just here in the state of Alabama. But there's this whole other group just down in the Caribbean. It was eye-opening. As a biologist, it was an eye-opening experience to me.
We have been reading with friends about how in many parts of the world, it's the problem about identifying species is that you really don't have zoologists, botanists. You just don't have people there. There's not enough people to really do the exploration and the footwork to get it done. Do you feel like there's a lot more to be found there where you're at? And my second question was a little clarification on what's the legal jurisdiction of Guantanamo Bay? I haven't exactly understood that. All right.
To your first question, there's probably much more there to discover. So scientists have been at Guantanamo on and off for almost 100 years now. So that first paper on Cuban cactus was in 1909. And a few of the naval officers over time have, you know, published a few things here and there. And then there's been many formal scientific studies done there as well on the coral reefs, on the algae, on the manatees. There's some very rare plants that are there, and so I suspect there's some hidden biodiversity in the plants and probably in some of the insects. It's true that in biology there is we're losing the people that really know how to do taxonomy, and in part going around naming and describing things, which is hugely important, is not always considered particularly sexy by funding authorities. So as a graduate student, you've got to get funding, you've got to get on grants, or your advisor has to have grants, and it's got to be something exciting. And sometimes it's hard to get funding for just kind of important work, but kind of sometimes considered some of the drudgery of biology. And so we are losing, especially as we're not bringing in a lot of people to become really, really good taxonomists, especially with respect to morphology. With DNA, you can do a lot of cool things with DNA relatively rapidly. So there's also been a big shift to, hey, let's just do all the DNA with everything without actually attaching that to good physical descriptions of what these organisms are. As to the legal status of the base, that's also complicated. And something I don't fully understand either. I mean, we operate down there based on a treaty, and so it's still Cuban property under American jurisdiction. It's the land of many rules, and yet the land of, well, we're not quite sure. And I think we've seen some of that borne out in just the legal battles over the status of the detainees down there. And all of that sort of stuff, we just kind of leave to the lawyers. But yeah, it's kind of confusing.
Do, do they still have Cubans that work on the base? I think at one time they did. Is this still now allowed, or are the Cuban Nationals allowed onto the base to work?
So Cuban Nationals no longer work on the base, in part in the 60s as part of the Cuban Revolution. Castro and his comrades made it very, very difficult. Basically, they would harass Cubans coming onto the base. And it reached a certain point where it was untenable. There were people that were working on the base, and they were given a choice, and this was just sometime in the 60s, I'm not sure exactly when. Do you want to stay on the base and work, or do you want to go back home tonight? And so some Cubans stayed. There's about 10 or 12, and this was one of these at the time, I suppose people figured this will last a couple weeks and life will go back to normal. And those Cubans that elected to stay on the base never went back home. And there's still a population of about, I think there's 10 or 15 Cubans that live on the base. They are all in their 80s and 90s. And the American government, we essentially take care of them and have allowed them to live out their lives on the base, and they never got to go back to their homeland. And let's see, something happened here. End show. There we go. Okay. Something popped up on my screen. Yeah, so they essentially have a old folks home for the remaining Cubans that are on the base.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. Bakkegard? Okay. If not, thank you very much, Dr. Bakkegard. That was a very informative talk. I know that I know a lot more about Guantanamo Bay than I knew before, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this morning. And thank you once again. For everybody else, we will be back tomorrow, same time, same station, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you and good morning.
All right. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.